So I'm joining you today from, speaking of worldviews, from the Spokane Indian Reservation in my home and via Starlink. Starlink has provided us an opportunity to work in this very remote location. We'll have certainly some discussions about Starlink later, about the challenges associated with it, and there's some equity issues, of course, there. But through the wonders of modern technology, I'm joining you today in my home on the Spokane Reservation, and hopefully bringing a worldview that informs the work of you all. So that quick introduction after being on the team here at the Washington State Broadband Office for just a few short months and transitioning over from as the tribal liaison, working with Dr. Lisa Brown in the director's office at Commerce. And then previous to that, I worked with the Colville tribes in north central Washington as their senior planner for economic development. And we did a tremendous amount of work in trying to deploy broadband into those communities. So, we work closely alongside the PUDs in the northern, north central Washington and Ferry County and Okanogan County. So I certainly want to give George an opportunity to present his introduction. So George, let me hand it off over to you.
Thank you, Ernie. And thank you for inviting both of us today. The way we have structured this conversation is we're going to make some introductory comments, and then we're going to have a few questions to share our thoughts. So the first thing I wanted to say was, like Laura, I have a cat too, and my cat has decided he really likes knocking my webcam off the top of my computer. And so when I lock him out, he screams. So I have a no-win situation. I apologize in advance. I'll try to keep him away. So as Laura actually said during the introduction to our conversation, one common theme we've heard in all the sessions today was that the future of work assumes connectivity. And I agree with that assumption, but there's still work to do to make that a reality. So I wanted to share a few thoughts in my introduction. So I'm going to date myself like the last panel. I am old enough to remember the time before the internet. In fact, I remember my first engagement with computer technology was typing punch cards, which were entered in a stack in a batch computer that always messed up with hanging chads off of the computer cards. And my first computer was called an Apple III. So yes, there was an Apple III. And if you want to see it, you can see it in the Smithsonian. So now that I've dated myself. So I want to give you three sort of testimonials to my thoughts on connectivity. So pre-pandemic, before we were forced into this situation we're in today, was the testimony at the legislature from a woman from Kitsap County who was testifying on a telecommunications policy bill. And what she told the committee, I thought was very compelling. She told the committee that basically she was tired of having to take her kids down to the mall to do their homework. I thought in the world where we have connectivity, that seemed not to be right. The second was after the pandemic hit and we set up these Wi-Fi hotspots throughout the state, was a middle school principal up in Shelton who told us at an event that he was surprised at the number of students that did not have connectivity. And he found out only because they were coming out to these Wi-Fi hotspots to do their work. The last item was a picture of a friend of mine and her daughter sitting in the back seat of their SUV with a homemade desk that her dad made so she could do her homework at a remote Wi-Fi spot. To me, those were indicative during the pandemic of just how much the problem is to make sure that everyone is connected. The access to broadband is as essential to our lives today as is safe water and electricity. This, in my opinion, is no longer debatable. It's no longer a debatable point. The challenge is to actually make it a reality. So with that introduction, I'm going to give Ernie the first chance at a question is, so what are the goals we are trying to reach?
Well, thank you, George, and those testimonies are pretty powerful. That, and they inform that goal, right? They help us understand where we're trying to go. As I shared, in our call yesterday, I'm a bit of a 7 habits person, and I really like to begin with, and that is of what it is that we're trying to achieve. Connectivity to not just connectivity, affordable connectivity, and I heard mention of it in the last panel. The skills development for folks to actually be able to utilize the technology in a way that is more than just being a consumer. They actually have the opportunity to become producers, influencers, and engage in whether it's an economy, an education system, healthcare system, whatever it might be, an opportunity, and trying to bring that to as much population as possible, but especially those that have been marginalized, overlooked, and just simply have not been able to access. That includes rural communities. When we start talking about equity challenges often are associated with communities of color, and this is not true with digital equity. The rural communities have been really kind of overlooked, and simply just haven't had the opportunity to be invested in. And so that's that big goal that we're trying to reach here, at least from my office and the work that we're doing. And George, I'd like to hear what you think on your end, coming at it from the PUD side.
So the goals that we see are based on the successful stories that we can tell about many areas of the state that have moved sort of beyond the arguments over who should do what and where and how, and more towards making sure that connectivity happens, but depending on the needs of the community. So I'm thinking of success stories in areas of state like in Grant County, Grays Harbor, City of Anacortes, Jefferson County, Skagit County. But I'm also thinking of something that we did as an association prior to the pandemic. And I mentioned this to you yesterday. Prior to the pandemic, when we were looking at broadband connectivity in the state, the proposal was to set up a state broadband office, the one that you're in now. So I represent elected officials throughout the state, and pretty much the last thing that my board would be interested in doing was supporting the creation of a state agency. Typically, they don't look fondly on that, and they're typically against it and say, why do we need it? In this case, it was the opposite. We believe strongly, and we supported it in the legislature, supported its funding, because we believe that the state needed to set up a long-term goal for connectivity. They needed to be a clearinghouse and a resource for getting state and federal funds and making sure that they were deployed in a way that made most sense in meeting the state goals. So our goal is to develop what we refer to as open access networks. Basically, it's a highway of internet, and let private service providers compete for business over that. We have great examples of that. Grant County is probably the best example, where Grant County builds the core infrastructure for the county. They still have about 20% left to go, but they have over a dozen private retail service providers providing competitive internet services to their community. Grays Harbor has this going on. Kitsap County has it going on. There's no reason that counties like Jefferson, Lincoln County, Pacific County, there's no reason that it can't happen. And it's not just PUDs. It's ports. It's private providers. It's private internet connectivity. It's everyone who's involved in bringing the internet through the system to the home. Everyone has to be involved in solving and resolving these problems, because my experience working on this has been only if everyone is in the room, the community, the elected officials, the private providers, the public providers, the folks with the funding, thinking about how do we solve this community's problem, the problems get solved. They don't get solved in silos. They don't get solved in debating policy. They get solved by everyone who understands the community and has a common shared goal in getting them connected, working on the project. That's been the success story where I can identify success stories.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. And, given that, we set up another question of what's our current situation, and, assessing where we are, now that we understand where we want to go, this current situation that, I find myself in is one example. And that is, again, having access to an emerging technology in a community that largely it's not available to. And I find myself, as my daughter, working for a food service dispatcher, one of these online food service delivery, and she's a dispatcher. She lives in a house, just a couple houses away from me. She would otherwise have to drive into Spokane for an hour and a half to go do this job, which is, not much more than a minimum wage job. But now she comes to our house and she does this job. She now has, childcare is accessible to her, and her commute time is now just, a few minutes rather than, a total of 3 hours out of the day. And now her earning time, amount of time dedicated to work is much better, is much more rewarding, and she now has more opportunity. So, that's a current situation that a lot of us find ourselves in. And again, where I live, I'm the only house that has this available. Starlink is not going to be deployed to every home in these remote situations overnight. It's just going to take a lot of time. I really like your point about coalition building in the community. At the Washington State Broadband Office, that's really that's what we're working to facilitate. That coalition building, not only just from the providers and the PUDs, but that cross section of anchor institutions, community members, tribes, local governments, all coming to the table. Yes, of course, we can all agree that broadband is important. Yes, of course, we can all understand its benefits. But the challenge becomes how? How do we get there? How do we do that in a coordinated, collaborative manner so that there's a mindfulness of the limited resources to meet this challenge, and so that we work together and in coordination with each other? So that's the work. I love that, George. I really appreciate you bringing that forward. And that is, I think, one of the, when we start talking about our current situation, that's the approach we're taking. That's one approach that we're taking here at the Washington State Broadband Office.
Yeah, so last session, there were a couple of policy bills that were passed by the legislature, funding bills. I look at these policy improvements, policy adoptions, similar as a tool belt to build a house. You don't want, just a hammer, just a saw. You've got to have multiple tools, but it does take an entire toolkit to build that house. And the one example I'll use about how coalitions and communities work is we had a chance to go up to Kitsap County, and we met with the public providers, the private providers, and we were talking about a couple of communities in Kitsap County that were not getting the service they wanted, right? It was some of the government people and the engineers. So the government people talked, and then the engineers talked. And when it was all done, the engineers identified that it was an upgrade to a box in the community that was a problem. Okay, that's a simple sort of anecdote, but it turns out that there are solutions that we just don't know until we get the right people in the room and identify the community and what's the problem. Now there is a lot of money out there. And we're hoping we know the state broadband office was created to be able to develop those dollars and be able to deploy them in mechanisms that work best. But we also know that there are communities out there that need help with adopting the technology so they can use the internet. It's interesting to note that the folks who go to Starbucks to get internet, which I do every once in a while, why would I pay if I can get it for free for Starbucks? Well, I'm not getting it for free, but I have free access to it. Well, it depends on your household. You're not going to get a telehealth visit at Starbucks. You wouldn't want to do that. It's not appropriate to do that. And you're not going to have your kids do their homework that you could monitor at Starbucks. You're going to want to be involved. You might do it at times, but also grades. I do remember, and this is dating myself, when your grades were on a piece of paper that you brought home to your parents to sign. And, you know, I never admit it, I never forged it. I'd like to at times. But today, everything is in internet. Everything's Skynet, like in the Terminator movies, watching over the internet. And those kind of things, telehealth, all the things that we've talked about in this day-long session are part of the ability to get those connected, those who already know how to get connected, who want better connections, but those who don't have connections today, who are eventually going to recognize that need. So that's sort of the situation we've got in areas that don't have connectivity. There are areas of the state that have no connectivity. They're not underserved, they're just not served. And we need to make those areas as important as those who want better service. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think are the impediments to moving forward?
There's a lot to unpack in what you just shared, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm going to stay focused here. But George, you talked about adoption, and so let me talk about that as even a barrier to how we're going to get there. I work, in this job, I'm working with tremendous, every community that possible across Washington State. Tremendous amount of diversity in communities, or diversity of communities. And that includes some of those most rural and remote areas of the state that are not currently served, as you mentioned. And they've talked about, why would we want to bring this into our communities? Why would we want to have this here only to invite other folks that are not a part of our community at this time into our community? And we begin to lose that characteristic that is so important to us. And my answer to them is that, as a Native American who believes in his culture, who wants to hold strongly to his culture, wants to hold it close, I know that broadband and the adoption of broadband, the adoption of this tool to preserve my culture is critically important. That my kids and my grandkids and their kids, in order for them to have access to the same culture, we're going to have to adopt this as a tool. So those rural areas, an adoption of this tool is a way to preserve that culture in your remote and rural area. So adoption is, it becomes a big question. So there's policy challenges, of course, other than just, our own attitudes towards broadband and being able to bring broadband into communities and have people willingly adopt it, accept it, get it to the point where they can actually turn it into a tool that's serving their communities. I think, as we continue to build out, the infrastructure, we need to actually have some standards for understanding what it means to serve folks. We've got the broad definition of 25.3 is, currently the definition of broadband. We have our state goals of 150 by 150 to homes in 2028. So we've got some of those things. Affordability is one of those that we still need to determine what the heck does affordability really mean as a federal definition. So there's still a lot of work and barriers. The public-private partnership that's necessary. And those are some of the things that are still ongoing, and we're going to continue to address, especially here in Washington State.
Great, thank you, Ernie. So we're gonna close up with some concluding remarks. So Ernie got to start first, so I'm gonna provide a conclusion, then turn it back to Ernie to end the conversation. So I wanted to cite two other examples from the recent past to make a point about how we move forward. So one has to do with, I'm secretary of my local Kiwanis Club, and when the pandemic hit, the first was, frantic, what are we gonna do? And then everyone went to Zoom, right? So we've been having meetings for the last year and a half via Zoom. And I remember a conversation with one of my Kiwanis members about learning Zoom. And I said, oh, it's really easy to learn. Boy, did I get a lecture. So there's a generational equity issue as well about adoption of internet and connectivity that we need to keep in mind, that there are cultural changes that need to be made to get used to this new hybrid world. The second has to do with two of my commissioners. And 10 years ago, when I started the PUD Association, I said, we ought to get video conferencing for our office. That wasn't a new idea back then, but I thought it would be good for us because we have folks coming in from the eastern part where you are. And we thought, well, maybe efficiency can help by having video conferencing. Boy, did I get pushback. I got pushback because I had commissioners come up to me and say, we love each other. We don't want to lose meeting. If you do this, we'll never see each other again. Sounds sort of predicting, what would happen today. But the pandemic forced us to engage in this virtual connectivity, and we're not going back. We're still going to meet when we need to. But for 2-hour meetings, we don't need people to drive 8 hours over the mountains in the snow for a 2-hour meeting. And I don't get pushback. Everyone's learned to use this new technology, but not use it to replace the FaceTime, as mentioned earlier, that we want, because many of our newly elected commissioners have never met each other because of the pandemic, but to use it effectively. So my concluding remark is, I think the challenge here, we've got the policies, we need some more, we've got the funding, we need some strategies, but what we need to do is to move beyond the battles we've fought in the past about who should do what and where, and focus and move forward into how do we get it done? And that's sort of my focus is, how do we get it done? So I appreciate the opportunity. Let me turn it back to you, Ernie, for some of your closing remarks.
George, I want to say thanks for that call to action and the context of the pandemic as being kind of revealing this challenge. The pandemic revealed so many things that so many of us took for granted or we just simply overlooked. Culturally, of course, there were we've seen the challenges. But this particular challenge, this broadband challenge, the pandemic revealed, the deficiencies where we are in this evolution of our technology and how accessible it is to everyone. And I want to thank you, George, and I want to echo really what you said. Bringing people together, being a convener, a fearless convener, and asking people to just come together and be willing to get it done.
And Ernie, thank you for the passion behind your discussion, and I'm sure we'll be working together in the future to make this happen.
Yeah, thank you, George.